If you want to know how thin blood relation can be, you only need to stand under a vintage Tiffany lamp on a storm-swept Boston night, and look at your mother's perfectly lacquered hair through a locked iron gate. Abigail Vance stood on the gravel driveway of number 14 Oak Street, the rain heavy enough to blind her. Her cheap plastic raincoat, bought for $3 from a gas station convenience store, was torn at the shoulder, letting the freezing April wind claw directly at her skin. Inside the colonial-style mansion, the lights were golden and warm. It was Easter Eve, and the faint, elegant sound of jazz by Miles Davis drifted out from the double-glazed windows, mixed with the crisp, polite laughter of the local country club elite. Abigail reached out her hand, her fingers trembling and blue from the cold, and pressed the brass intercom button next to the gate for the fourth time. "Mom," her voice was hoarse, muffled by the howling wind. "It's Abby. Please, just unlock the gate. I don't need money. I just need a place to dry my clothes for tonight. Just tonight." The intercom crackled with static. A second later, the heavy oak front door of the mansion opened a crack. But it wasn't her mother who stepped onto the covered porch, it was her older brother, Richard Vance. He was wearing a tailored charcoal cashmere sweater, holding a glass of single malt scotch in his right hand. He didn't walk down into the rain. He merely stood under the porch light, his left hand casually adjusting the heavy platinum strap of his Rolex, a subconscious habit he had whenever he was looking down on someone. "Abby, for God's sake, stop buzzing," Richard's voice came through the intercom speaker, flat and dripping with irritation. "You're disturbing the guests. Mrs. Higgins from the Homeowners Association is right inside. Do you have any idea how it looks to have someone dressed like a homeless vagrant loitering outside our driveway?" "I'm not loitering, Richard. I'm your sister." Abigail's knuckles turned white as she gripped the wet iron bars. "My ex-husband cleared out our joint bank account. The locks on my apartment were changed by the landlord this morning because the rent check bounced. I have $7 in my pocket. Every single credit card has been declined." Richard took a slow sip of his scotch. Through the grey curtain of rain, Abigail could see the faint, mocking smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. "And whose fault is that?" Richard sighed, a sound of heavy, theatrical disappointment. "We all warned you when you married that small-time real estate speculator. You thought you were smarter than everyone else. Now he leaves you with a pile of bad debt, and you run back here to ruin Mom's Easter party. You've always been the financial black sheep of this family, Abby. You lack the Vance discipline." Before Abigail could speak, another figure appeared behind Richard. Eleanor Vance, their mother, stepped out onto the porch, a pale blue silk scarf draped over her shoulders. She looked pristine, every strand of her grey hair held perfectly in place by expensive styling gel. Seeing her daughter shivering in a torn plastic sheet outside the gate, Eleanor's first reaction wasn't to look at Abigail's face, but to glance anxiously at the neighbors' windows across the street. "Richard, what is taking so long?" Eleanor murmured, though her voice carried perfectly through the open microphone. Then, she leaned slightly toward the intercom. "Abby, dear. You really shouldn't have come like this without calling. It's highly inappropriate. Richard is trying to secure a very important listing from the country club members tonight. We cannot afford a scene." "A scene?" Abigail's voice finally broke, a sharp, bitter sound against the thunder. "Mom, I spent the last 4 hours at the South End Community Shelter, but they were completely full. They handed me a cup of instant coffee that tasted like dish soap and told me to try the train station. I am your daughter. I just need the couch." Eleanor's hand rose to her collar, her fingers nervously twitching, as if she were mentally pruning her garden's hydrangeas to cope with the stress. "The couch? Oh, darling, the living room is full of catering equipment for tomorrow's brunch. Look, there's a lovely, clean municipal shelter over near Logan Airport. I'm sure if you take the subway." "The subway closed 30 minutes ago," Abigail said. Her voice suddenly went dead quiet. The frantic pleading vanished, replaced by an eerie, hollow calm. Richard stepped forward, his tone dropping into a sharper, more dismissive register. "All right, enough. I'll call an Uber for you if you promise to leave right now, and not use the family name at whatever motel you find. Oh, wait, I forgot, your phone is probably disconnected because you couldn't pay the bill." He let out a short, dry laugh, the kind of corporate chuckle he used when out negotiating a desperate home seller. "Take a walk to the diner down the highway, Abby. The rain might wash some of that failure off you." The intercom clicked off. The porch lights died. The heavy oak door shut with a solid, echoing thud. Abigail stood motionless in the dark. The water was soaking through her cheap canvas shoes, freezing her toes. She looked at the iron gate, the beautiful, intricate, yet deeply rusted barrier that separated her from the people who shared her DNA. In that exact moment, something shifted inside her. The warmth of familial hope didn't just fade, it crystallized into something solid, cold, and heavy. She turned around and began to walk down Oak Street, her wet shoes making a squelching sound against the asphalt. She didn't notice the black Lincoln Town car parked under the shadow of a spreading maple tree 50 yards down the road. Inside the car, the dashboard lights were dimmed. A man in his late 50s sat in the driver's seat, wearing a worn tweed flat cap and holding a silver flask. He had been watching the entire scene at the gate through his rain-streaked windshield. As Abigail walked past the car, her head held low against the wind, the window rolled down 3 inches. "Hey, kid," a voice called out. It was rough, gravelly, and smelled faintly of cheap bourbon and old paper. Abigail stopped, her defensive instincts instantly flaring. She tightened her grip on her old canvas tote bag. "I don't have any money." The man in the car let out a low grunt, using a small wooden toothpick to fiddle with his teeth before speaking. "I can see that. If you had money, those 2 high society clowns back there would have opened the gate and kissed your shoes." He pushed the passenger side door open from the inside. "Get in before you turn into a block of ice. The heat is on." Abigail hesitated for exactly 3 seconds. She looked back at the dark, silent road behind her, then at the warm, fabric-scented interior of the old sedan. She climbed in. The blast of hot air from the dashboard vents hit her face, making her skin sting. "Marcus Thorne," the man said, not offering his hand, but instead passing her a clean, dry flannel towel from the back seat. "I'm an independent asset liquidator. I was actually in the neighborhood to appraise a bankrupt bakery 3 blocks down." Abigail began to rub her dripping hair, her teeth still chattering. "Abigail Vance. Though after tonight, just Abby will do." Marcus put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb. He didn't offer any words of comfort, no soft-hearted sympathy. He just looked at her through the rearview mirror, his eyes sharp as scalpels under his heavy brows. "I saw the show back there," Marcus said, taking a quick swig from his flask. "Your brother's Richard, right? The guy who plasters his face on every bus bench in the metro area, calling himself a luxury estate specialist." Abigail let out a cold, hollow breath. "That's him. He's currently living off our mother's retirement fund while trying to pretend he's a partner at Goldman Sachs. And the old lady thinks he's the next American tycoon." Marcus nodded, his voice dripping with cynical amusement. "Classic suburban delusion. They love the smell of their own brand, even when the company is bleeding to death." He stopped at a red light, turning his head to look directly at her. "You know what I do for a living, Abby. You said asset liquidation. You sell off things that belong to people who failed." "Exactly. When businesses go under, when families default, when the bank realizes the shiny facade is hollow, they call me. I don't use lawyers unless I absolutely have to. Lawyers are slow, expensive, and they care about the rules. I care about the ledger. I look at what people owe, what they want, and I use their own greed to take everything left. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy silver pen, tossing it into her lap. You've got that look in your eye right now. The look of someone who has lost her illusions. That's the most valuable asset in my business. Abby picked up the pen. It was heavy, cold, and perfectly balanced. She looked out the window as they drove past the brightly lit storefronts of downtown Boston, banks, high-end boutiques, luxury apartments. All built on the fragile promise of credit and appearance. What are you offering, Mr. Thorne? She asked softly. An apprenticeship, Marcus said, his voice flat. No salary for the first 3 weeks. You sleep on the cot in the back of my archive office. You learn how to read a balance sheet to find where people hide their shame. You learn how to talk to creditors so they think you're their best friend, right before you cut their throats. If you survive 18 months, you'll know how to buy and sell people like your brother for pennies on the dollar. Abby closed her hand around the silver pen. The image of Eleanor's nervous hand pruning the hydrangeas and Richard's smug smile, as he adjusted his Rolex, burned into her mind, not as a source of pain, but as a blueprint. When do we start? She asked. Marcus turned the car into a dark, industrial alleyway lined with brick warehouses, the smell of salt water and old iron rising from the nearby harbor. Right now, kid. Money has no temperature. It only has a direction. Let's make sure it starts flowing away from Oak Street. 18 months in the asset liquidation business will completely cure a woman of any lingering sentimentality about the American dream. Abby sat in a dim, windowless office in the basement of a brick warehouse near the Boston Wharf, a half-eaten, lukewarm pastrami sandwich sitting next to her elbow. The air smelled of old paper, industrial dust, and the sharp, chemical tang of the cheap floor cleaner Marcus bought in bulk. Her wardrobe had completely changed, gone with the soft, pastel-colored linen blouses her mother used to approve of. Tonight, she wore a sharp, charcoal black tailored blazer with subtle wear at the cuffs, and her hair was pinned back in a ruthless, efficient knot that didn't require a single second of mirror gazing. Before her lay 3 separate computer monitors, flashing with the credit histories, property deeds, and hidden corporate entities of 3 failing local logistics companies. You're staring at that spreadsheet like you want to marry it, kid, Marcus's voice grunted from the doorway. He was wearing his usual wrinkled tweed vest, a toothpick hanging loosely from his lower lip. He carried a fresh brown paper bag containing 2 cups of premium black coffee. Abby didn't look up from her screen, her fingers flying across the mechanical keyboard with rhythmic, staccato clicks. I don't want to marry it, Marcus. I want to dissect it. The owners of this trucking firm claim they have no liquidity to pay their secondary creditors, but look at row 47. They've been leasing a private hangar at a regional airport in New Hampshire under a shell company called Blue Sky Holdings. There's a $500,000 Beechcraft turboprop sitting in that hangar right now. Marcus walked over, set her coffee down, and leaned over her shoulder, squinting through his thick reading glasses. A slow, wolfish grin spread across his gravelly face. He took a swig from his ever-present silver flask. Well, I'll be damned. The old New Hampshire shell game. You found the airplane. I found the airplane, Abby agreed, finally stopping her fingers and picking up the coffee cup. She took a sip, her eye twitching slightly. And thank God you finally stopped buying that gas station swill. If I have to drink coffee that tastes like municipal tap water one more time, I'm going to liquidate your estate while you're sleeping. Hey, respect the budget, Marcus chuckled, pulling up a squeaking metal chair. But you're right. You've got the instinct now. You don't look at what people say they have, you look at what they are trying desperately to hide. The ego always leaves a trail. Ego always leaves a trail. That phrase echoed in Abby's mind as she stared back at the screen. Over the past year and a half, she hadn't sent a single email, text, or letter to number 14 Oak Street. She had effectively become a ghost to the Vance family. But that didn't mean she wasn't watching. In her line of work, monitoring the local real estate registries was as natural as breathing. 2 months ago, she had noticed a subtle, red flag tremor in the public records. Richard Vance had registered a new entity called Vance Luxury Sovereign Funds. To the average suburban investor, it sounded grand and bulletproof. To Abby, who had spent 18 months tracing the desperate maneuvers of dying businesses, it looked like a classic, panicked scramble for fast capital. "What's that smirk for?" Marcus asked, watching her face closely. "Nothing," Abby said smoothly, closing the logistics file and opening a fresh, blank ledger. "Just thinking about how much people are willing to borrow just to maintain the illusion that they don't need to borrow. That's the exact fuel that runs our engine, kid. Speak of the devil, we have the municipal auction for the East Boston warehouse district tomorrow morning. Some high-flying real estate brokers are trying to force a short sale on 3 industrial lots. They think they can bully the city into a quick turnover. I want you to handle the bidding." Abby looked at the auction manifest. Her eyes locked onto the name of the primary brokerage representing the mysterious buyer, *Vance, and Associates Real Estate. A quiet, icy hum went through her veins. "Consider it done, Marcus." The next morning, the City Hall auction room was packed with the usual crowd of developers, hard money lenders, and overly aggressive brokers smelling cheap blood. Abigail sat in the 3rd row, dressed in her dark blazer, a simple leather folio in her lap. She kept her head down, reviewing the property valuations she had calculated to the penny. 10 minutes before the bidding started, a loud, familiar voice echoed from the back of the room. "Look, I told you, tell the client we have the local zoning board in our pocket for the rezoning," Richard Vance was saying, walking down the aisle while loudly talking into his Bluetooth earpiece. He was wearing a bright blue silk tie, his hair practically laminated with expensive pomade, and his left hand was doing its familiar dance, frantic, nervous adjustments of his heavy Rolex strap. "The city wants this off their books. We bid low, we lock it down, and we flip it to the hotel developers by summer." Richard took a seat just 2 rows ahead of Abby, completely oblivious to her presence. He smelled heavily of expensive cologne and anxiety. The auctioneer cleared his throat, slamming the gavel. Item 104, 3 contiguous commercial lots, South Wharf District. Minimum bid starts at $400,000. Richard immediately raised his paddle. 450. A developer in the front row countered, 475. 500, Richard snapped back, his voice full of casual, performative arrogance, looking around the room to ensure everyone noticed his confidence. Abby didn't move. She waited, watching the tiny, telltale signs of Richard's posture. He was tapping his shiny leather shoe against the floorboards. His breathing was shallow. He was bidding with capital he didn't actually possess yet. He was banking on the other bidders dropping out early out of respect for his luxury broker reputation. 500,000 going once, the auctioneer called. Going twice. Abby calmly raised her paddle. 510,000. Richard stiffened. He didn't look back immediately, merely assuming it was another standard competitor. He gritted his teeth and raised his paddle again. 550. 560, Abby's voice was flat, devoid of any theatrical emotion, dropping into the room like a cold lead weight. Richard spun around in his seat, irritation flashing across his face. Listen, buddy, we're prepared to take this all the way, he stopped mid-sentence. His eyes adjusted to the dim lighting of the third row, locking onto Abby's face. For a terrifying 3 seconds, Richard's brain tried to process the data. The woman sitting there had the same facial structure as his ruined sister, but the posture was entirely wrong. This woman didn't have the desperate, pleading look of the girl in the torn plastic raincoat. Her eyes were dead, analytical, and entirely steady. She didn't flinch under his gaze. She simply held her paddle at a perfect 90-degree angle. "Abby?" Richard whispered, his voice cracking slightly, dropping out of his professional broker persona. "The bid is at $560,000 to the lady in the third row," the auctioneer barked, cutting through the silence. "Do I hear 570? Richard's face flushed a deep, panicked crimson. He looked down at his financial sheet. He knew his limit, or rather, the limit of the secret loan he had pulled against their mother's Oak Street estate, was exactly $550. He had overstretched, thinking he could scare the room into silence. "Mr. Vance," the auctioneer pressed. "Are you in for 570? Richard looked back at Abby, his teeth clenched so hard his jaw muscle shook. He tried to project his usual authority, but the high-pitched wheeze in his breath betrayed him. This property has undisclosed environmental liabilities. My firm is withdrawing its bid on professional grounds." A few low chuckles rippled through the room from the older, seasoned developers, who knew exactly what a bidder looked like when they ran out of cash. "Sold. For $560,000 to Thorne and Associates Asset Management." Abby stood up, closed her leather folio with a crisp, satisfying snap, and walked down the aisle toward the clerk's desk to finalize the paperwork. As she passed Richard, she didn't slow down, nor did she look at him with malice. She merely gave him a polite, corporate nod, the kind one gives to a stranger who accidentally bumped into you on the subway. "Good effort, Mr. Vance," she said softly, her voice cool and perfectly modulated. "But next time, make sure your line of credit matches your tie." Richard stood frozen in the aisle, his hand gripped so tightly around his platinum Rolex strap that the metal links groaned. He watched her back disappear into the clerk's office, his mind spinning into a chaotic mix of confusion, anger, and a sudden, cold prickle of unexplainable fear. The grand ballroom of the Fairmont Hotel was a symphony of old money and desperate new appearances. Sparkling crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow over 400 guests assembled for the annual Boston Children's Hospital Charity Gala, the exact type of high society event Eleanor Vance would spend 6 months planning her wardrobe for. Eleanor stood near the champagne fountain, wearing a vintage emerald silk gown that smelled faintly of mothballs and dry cleaner fluid. Her fingers were curled tightly around the stem of her glass, her eyes scanning the crowd with a restless, avian intensity. "Richard, stand up straight," Eleanor muttered under her breath, her smile frozen perfectly for the passing photographers. "Mrs. Higgins just looked over here from the VIP lounge. If she sees you slouching like a tired clerk, it will ruin our chances of getting invited to her summer estate in Newport." Richard, standing beside her in a rented tuxedo that was slightly too tight around the waist, let out a sharp, anxious breath. His left hand was doing its familiar dance, aggressively twisting the strap of his Rolex. "Mom, forget Newport for a second. The underwriters for the sovereign fund are breathing down my neck. If we don't secure at least 3 high-net-worth investors tonight to cover the cash flow gap from that botched warehouse bid, the bank is going to flag the Oak Street title for review." "Hush!" Eleanor hissed, her voice dropping into a sharp whisper while her face maintained its serene, maternal mask. "Do not use the word bank in this room. Perception is reality, Richard. As long as people see us here, buying $10,000 tables, they assume the Vance name is solid gold." Before Richard could answer, the room's ambient noise began to dip, a wave of hushed whispers cascading from the mahogany entrance doors toward the center of the ballroom. The charity committee chairman, an old-money billionaire named Arthur Sterling, was walking into the room, but he wasn't leading the town's usual politicians. He was playing escort to a young woman. She wore an asymmetrical midnight blue satin gown that had no lace, no sequins, and no need for them. Her hair was swept up in a flawless, architectural chignon, revealing a pair of simple diamond studs that caught the light like ice. Her movement was fluid, calm, and entirely devoid of the nervous, social climbing energy that filled the rest of the room. It was Abigail Vance. But it wasn't the Abby who used to apologize for taking up space in the family portrait. Behind her walked Marcus Thorne, looking surprisingly clean in a dark charcoal suit, though he still carried himself like a wolf who had accidentally wandered into a sheep convention. "My goodness," Eleanor whispered, her hand flying to her throat, her fingers instinctively twitching as if she were mentally shearing a damaged bush. "Richard, is that your sister?" Richard's glass of scotch shook so hard a drop spilled onto his white cuff. "It's her. It's the girl from the City Hall auction. Mom, she's with Arthur Sterling." Across the ballroom, Abigail felt the weight of their stare, but she didn't look over immediately. She was listening politely to Sterling describe a commercial portfolio downtown. "The market is softening, Abby," Sterling was saying, his tone carrying the deep respect one reserves for a peer. "My board was terrified of those delinquent commercial bonds on the harbor project, but the way your firm restructured the liquidation timeline, you saved us $12 million in tax exposure. Marcus told me you personally found the loophole in the maritime leasing clauses." Abby offered a small, elegant smile, her voice carrying smoothly over the soft violin music. "When people are panicked, Mr. Sterling, they tend to read the big numbers and skip the fine print in the addendums. That's usually where the truth is buried." "Brilliant," Sterling laughed, raising his glass. "Come, there are some people from the sovereign wealth groups you absolutely must meet." As Sterling led Abby and Marcus toward the center of the room, Eleanor, driven by a chaotic mixture of maternal opportunistic instinct and sheer social desperation, stepped directly into their path. She forced her way past a group of junior developers, her emerald skirt rustling loudly. "Abigail. Oh, my darling girl." Eleanor's voice rose into a slightly theatrical, high society pitch, loud enough to catch the attention of 3 nearby tables. She reached her arms out, attempting to wrap Abby in an expensive, perfume-scented embrace. Abby didn't flinch. She simply took a half step back, exactly enough distance to prevent physical contact while remaining perfectly polite. She held out her right hand, her grip firm and professional. "Good evening, Mrs. Vance," Abby said, her voice cool, clear, and perfectly balanced. The ballroom air seemed to drop 5 degrees. Eleanor's arms froze mid-air, her face turning a strange, mottled shade of pink beneath her heavy foundation. "Mrs. Vance." "Abby, sweetie, what are you saying?" "It's Mom. And look, Richard is right here." Richard stepped forward, his face flushed, trying to force his way into Arthur Sterling's line of sight. "Abby, stop playing games. We've been worried sick about you for 18 months. You just vanish into thin air, and now you're attending galas without even letting the family know you're alive. It's incredibly selfish." Marcus Thorne let out a low, gravelly chuckle from behind Abby, pulling a small silver toothpick from his pocket, and looking at Richard with absolute amusement. "Worried sick, huh? Is that why your luxury real estate firm spent the last 3 months trying to run a background check on our junior partners to see who was outbidding you in the South Wharf district?" Richard's mouth opened and closed like a stranded carp. That was standard market intelligence." "Abby, please," Eleanor interrupted, her breath hitched in that high-pitched, wheezing rhythm that always signaled her impending loss of control. She looked around, realizing that Mrs. Higgins and several other prominent committee members were now openly staring at them. "Whatever little misunderstanding we had on Easter, it was just a silly family squabble. You know how stressful hosting those large events can be. We just wanted you to be responsible. And look at you now. You've clearly done so well. Richard's fund is actually looking for a primary institutional partner tonight. We should all sit at our table and discuss it as a family." Abby looked at her mother. She looked at the intricate silver embroidery on Eleanor's gown, then down at Richard's rented tuxedo. There was no anger in Abby's eyes, and that was what terrified Eleanor the most. There was only the cold, detached gaze of an auditor looking at a fraudulent balance sheet. I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding, Mrs. Vance, Abby said, her voice echoing clearly for the surrounding audience. I am here tonight as the chief operating partner of Thorne and Sterling Asset Management. We don't partner with speculative family funds. In fact, my team spent the last 48 hours reviewing the secondary debt markers in the New England real estate sector. Abby took a step closer to Richard, her voice dropping into a quiet, lethal register that only the immediate circle could hear. Your luxury sovereign fund has a leverage ratio of 4-to-1, Richard. You've been using the equity of number 14 Oak Street as cross-collateral for 3 separate non-performing commercial loans. The secondary creditors sold those notes to a consolidated clearinghouse last Tuesday morning. Richard's face went completely white. The glass of scotch finally slipped from his fingers, shattering loudly against the parquet floor. The amber liquid splashed across his shiny patent leather shoes. How do you know about the clearinghouse? Abby adjusted the cuff of her midnight blue gown, her expression entirely serene. Because I bought them, Richard. I am the clearinghouse now. Eleanor looked from her son's panicked, sweating face to her daughter's icy, immaculate composure. Her perfect, lacquered hairstyle seemed to lose its structural integrity as a strand fell loose against her cheek. Abby, you wouldn't, we are your family. Family is an asset that requires mutual maintenance, Mrs. Vance, Abby said softly, turning back to Arthur Sterling without a second glance. Now, if you'll excuse us, Mr. Sterling has some actual investors he'd like me to meet. As Abby walked away, her satin train gliding smoothly over the broken glass, Marcus Thorne paused beside the frozen, trembling Richard. He took a slow sip from his silver flask, patted Richard's stiff shoulder with a heavy hand, and smirked. Keep an eye on that Rolex, kid, Marcus whispered with a gravelly chuckle. You might need to list it under exempt personal property by the end of the month. The vintage espresso machine in the corner of the Newbury Street Cafe hissed loudly, releasing a cloud of bitter, aromatic steam. Abby watched the dark liquid drip into her porcelain cup, her eyes tracing the perfect, thick crema. Outside, a chilly autumn wind was chasing dead maple leaves down the brick sidewalk. Across the small, marble-topped table sat Eleanor Vance. The pristine suburban matriarch was gone. Eleanor's signature emerald silks had been replaced by a nondescript beige trench coat, the collar turned up, as if she were trying to hide from the very street names she used to boast about. Her hands, usually so steady when pruning her precious hydrangeas, were trembling violently as she tried to tear open a packet of artificial sweetener. Abby, please, Eleanor whispered, her voice carrying that thin, high-pitched wheeze that had now become permanent. You have to talk to the board at the clearinghouse. Richard made a mistake. A technical error. He didn't mean to misrepresent the cross-collateral filters. He's your brother. Abby took a slow, deliberate sip of her coffee, savoring the perfect balance of the medium roast before setting the cup down with a faint, sharp click against the marble. An error, Mrs. Vance, is when you forget to carry the 2 on a grocery receipt, Abby said, her voice dropping into the quiet, conversational tone of a doctor explaining a terminal diagnosis. Richard signed 3 separate affidavits stating that the Oak Street estate was free of secondary liens, while simultaneously using a New Hampshire shell company to borrow $800,000 against the back acreage. That isn't an error. That's a federal wire fraud indicator. Eleanor's face seemed to sag, the deep lines around her mouth cutting through her fading makeup. The bank sent a formal notice yesterday morning. They are initiating a non-judicial foreclosure on the house. They gave us 30 days to cure the default or vacate the premises. Abby, that house has been in the Vance family name for 3 generations. Your grandfather built the sunroom with his own hands. And Richard leveraged it to buy non-performing retail strip malls in Ohio, Abby countered smoothly. She reached into her leather folio and pulled out a single sheet of cream-colored paper, sliding it across the table. This is a courtesy copy of the secondary debt registry. As of 9 o'clock this morning, Thorne and Sterling has officially absorbed the remaining tranches of your family's unsecured liabilities. The Country Club Bank didn't just decide to foreclose on you, Eleanor. They sold the paper to me because I offered them 92 cents on the dollar in cash. Eleanor stared at the paper, her eyes widening as she recognized Abby's elegant, precise signature at the bottom of the liquidation authorization. Why? Why are you doing this to us? We didn't throw you to the wolves, Abby. We were just trying to teach you a lesson about financial responsibility. You were married to a criminal. Abby leaned forward slightly, her dark blazer framing her posture like a shadow. For the first time, a faint, cold smile played at the corner of her lips. When I stood outside your gate 18 months ago in a torn plastic raincoat, I didn't ask you for a loan, Eleanor. I asked you for a dry towel and a couch. Richard told me to wash the failure off myself in the rain, and you told me to take the subway to a municipal shelter when the subway was already closed. Abby touched the heavy silver pen sitting next to her cup. You didn't want to teach me a lesson. You wanted to protect your standing with Mrs. Higgins from the Homeowners Association. You were terrified that the neighbors might see a broken Vance. We can fix it. Eleanor reached out, her manicured fingers desperate to grasp Abby's wrist, but Abby calmly moved her arm out of reach to pick up her coffee cup again. We can declare bankruptcy. Richard says if we enter Chapter 11, the automatic stay will freeze the foreclosure. We can tie you up in court for years. You could have, Abby murmured, taking another sip. If Richard hadn't tried to save himself by transferring the title of the Oak Street property into his new sovereign fund last month to shield it from his personal creditors. By doing that, he stripped the house of its residential homestead protection. It's now classified as a commercial asset owned by a delinquent corporate entity. There is no automatic stay for fraudulent conveyance, Eleanor. Marcus and I reviewed the filing hours before he submitted it. As if on cue, the cafe door jingled open. Marcus Thorne walked in, wearing his oversized trench coat and a battered wool cap. He didn't look at Eleanor. He simply dropped a thick, manila folder onto the table next to Abby's folio, then pulled a wooden toothpick from his mouth, looking out the window at the passing traffic. The country club board just voted, kid, Marcus said, his rough, gravelly voice cutting through the cafe's soft indie music. Richard went to the clubhouse this morning to beg Mrs. Higgins' husband for an emergency line of credit. He brought his Rolex as a good faith deposit. Marcus let out a low, venomous chuckle. Sterling already called Higgins last night. The country club doesn't want their name mixed up in a public auction of a prominent neighborhood estate. They cancelled Richard's membership effective noon today. He was escorted out of the grill room by security. Eleanor let out a sharp, choked gasp, her hand flying to her collar. Her social world, the carefully curated ecosystem of brunches, charity committees, and polite golf claps, had just collapsed into a black hole. Escorted out? Oh, dear God, the neighbors. The neighbors are currently watching a city surveyor mark the property lines on Oak Street, Abby said, her voice entirely flat, as she closed her folio and stood up. She pulled a $10 bill from her pocket and dropped it onto the table to cover the coffee. Your son's arrogance was built on a foundation of unearned credit, Mrs. Vance. And the problem with credit is that eventually, the real owner comes to collect the principal. Eleanor looked up, her eyes wild and swimming with tears. Where are we supposed to go, Abby? Where am I supposed to put my things? My furniture, my mother's silver. Abby adjusted the lapel of her blazer, looking down at the broken matriarch with the detached serenity of a cleared ledger. I believe there is a very lovely, clean municipal shelter over near Logan Airport, Abby said softly, her tone echoing the exact words used on that icy Easter Eve. I'm sure if you take the subway, they'll have a cup of coffee waiting for you. Just watch out for the flavor, it tastes a bit like dish soap. Without waiting for an answer, Abby turned and walked toward the exit, her boots clicking firmly against the hardwood floor. Marcus followed her, pausing at the door to take a quick swig from his silver flask, leaving Eleanor alone at the marble table, surrounded by the cold steam of a dying empire. The morning of November the 1st arrived with a biting, grey frost that coated the manicured lawns of Oak Street like crushed glass. At exactly 9 o'clock, a massive, yellow commercial moving van backed down the gravel driveway of number 14, its reverse gear beeper echoing sharply through the quiet, affluent suburban neighborhood. Abby sat in the passenger seat of the black Lincoln Town car parked across the street, holding a ceramic travel mug filled with hot, black Sumatra coffee. She didn't look at her phone. She didn't need to. Her eyes were fixed on the heavy, intricate iron gate that had once seemed like an impassable fortress. The county sheriff's deputies just arrived at the back entrance, Marcus said from the driver's seat, shifting a toothpick from one side of his mouth to the other as he leaned against the steering wheel. He cracked his window slightly, letting in the crisp, autumn air. Richard's inside. Apparently, he spent the last 12 hours barricaded in the study, trying to delete his digital ledger archives. The idiot doesn't realize we already cloned his server hard drives 3 weeks ago. Abby took a slow, deliberate sip of her coffee. Let's go, Marcus. The moving crew is on the clock, and I don't like paying for idle labor. When Abby stepped out of the car, she wasn't wearing the defensive blazer of an apprentice, nor the grand evening gown of a gala guest. She wore a simple, incredibly elegant charcoal cashmere coat, her hands tucked casually into her pockets. Her face was a mask of absolute, calm authority. As she walked up the driveway, several neighbors, including Mrs. Higgins, who was pretending to sweep her front porch 50 yards away, openly stared through high-end binoculars. The pristine facade of the Vance family was being publicly dismantled, and the entire community was arriving for the show. The front door of the mansion flew open, and Richard Vance stumbled out onto the porch. His hair, usually so perfectly laminated with expensive gel, was wild and greasy. His expensive tailored shirt was wrinkled, stained with sweat at the collar, and his left hand was frantically, violently tearing at his Rolex strap. Except the watch was gone, hocked days ago to pay for a useless corporate defense retainer. Abby! You can't do this! Richard screamed, his voice cracking into that high-pitched, desperate wheeze as he ran down the porch steps. The movers are taking the dining table. That's grandfather's mahogany. You have no legal right to touch personal family heirlooms. Abby stopped at the bottom of the steps, looking at him with the detached curiosity of an inspector reviewing a damaged piece of cargo. Every single piece of furniture inside this house was registered as a corporate asset under the Vance Luxury Sovereign Fund to claim a depreciation tax write-off. Richard, Abby said, her voice dropping into the crisp, quiet cadence that carried perfectly through the cold air. When the fund defaulted on the secondary notes, the asset inventory became the property of the clearinghouse. You signed the asset schedule yourself. Page 14, Appendix B. You tricked me. Richard roared, his face turning a dangerous, mottled purple, as 2 uniformed sheriff's deputies stepped between him and Abby. You targeted my fund. You manipulated the secondary market to squeeze my lines of credit. No, Richard, Abby corrected softly, her expression entirely serene. I didn't manipulate anything. I simply stood at the bottom of the hill and waited for the rocks you threw to roll back down. You bought properties with money you didn't have, relying on a family name that was already hollowed out by your own vanity. I didn't destroy you. Your own balance sheet did. Just then, Eleanor Vance emerged from the front door. She looked incredibly frail, wrapped in an old wool shawl that looked decades old. She wasn't looking at the movers carrying out her crystal chandeliers. Her eyes were fixed on the neighbors whispering at the edge of the property line. Her social mask hadn't just cracked, it had disintegrated into dust. Abby. Eleanor whispered, her voice trembling as she walked toward her daughter, her fingers nervously twitching against her shawl, as if she were trying to prune a phantom rosebush. The neighbors are watching. Mrs. Higgins is looking right at us. Please, darling, tell them to stop. Can't we just go inside and talk about a payment plan? We can pay you interest. We can make this right. Abby looked at her mother. She saw the desperation, the frantic anxiety about appearances, that had driven Eleanor to leave her own daughter in a freezing rainstorm 18 months ago. There is no payment plan for a bankrupt illusion, Eleanor, Abby said, her voice gentle but completely unyielding. The house is sold. The corporate entity is liquidated. The ledger is officially closed. Abby turned to the foreman of the moving crew, pulling her heavy silver pen from her pocket and signing the final execution order on his digital clipboard with a swift, fluid stroke. Clear the house. Every room. Leave the walls bare. And what about the gate? Marcus asked from behind her, a wolfish grin spreading across his rugged face as he pointed a thumb toward the intricate iron barrier at the driveway entrance. The new buyer wants a modern, open-concept front landscape. They don't want this rusty old cage. Abby looked at the iron gate, the exact gate that had muffled the sound of Miles Davis's jazz while she shivered in a $3 plastic raincoat. Take it down, Abby ordered flatly. Sell the iron for scrap. Use the proceeds to buy a premium espresso machine for the local public shelter downtown. Abby, please. Eleanor wailed, her voice echoing down Oak Street as the moving crew began to unscrew the heavy brass hinges of the gate with a loud, mechanical grinding sound. Where are we supposed to live? Richard, do something. But Richard couldn't do anything. He was currently sitting on the bottom step of the porch, his head in his hands, his breath coming in short, pathetic wheezes, as he realized that the luxury estate specialist had officially been liquidated by the sister he had mocked. Abby didn't look back. She turned her back on the mansion, on her family, and on the rusted fragments of her old life. She walked down the driveway, her boots clicking firmly against the gravel, and climbed back into the passenger seat of the black Lincoln. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Late that evening, the storm returned to Boston, a heavy, cold November rain lashing against the city. Abby sat alone on a green wooden bench in the public garden, her charcoal cashmere coat wrapped tightly around her. The park was empty, save for the old trees swaying in the wind. In her hand, she held a cardboard cup of top-tier Sumatra coffee, the steam rising into the damp air. The rain was just as cold as it had been 18 months ago. The wind was just as sharp. But as Abby looked out over the glowing lights of the city skyline, she realized she wasn't shivering. The cold didn't hurt her anymore, it belonged to her. She took a slow, peaceful sip of her coffee, savoring the rich, heavy flavor. A few blocks away, number 14 Oak Street stood completely dark, completely empty, its iron gate gone forever. True Security was never a name on a deed, nor was it the warmth of a hypocritical family parlor. True security was knowing exactly what you were worth when everything else was stripped away. Abby smiled softly into the dark, the rain washing over the pavement, clean, quiet, and completely free.